January 17, 1943, Casablanca, Morocco. The morning air hung thick with salt and smoke, the Atlantic wind carrying the acrid stench of cordite across the ravaged harbor. Lieutenant Eugene Fuller knelt in the sand beside a German SC-500 bomb, half buried where it had punched through the wooden deck of a merchant vessel 3 days prior. The fuse assembly, still intact, protruded like a mechanical flower waiting to bloom into annihilation. Fuller's hands, steady despite the tremor in his chest, worked the diffuser wrench clockwise, slowly, deliberately, as if coaxing a confession from metal and chemistry. Around him the world held its breath. Dock workers had retreated 200 yards. The only sounds were the cry of gulls and the metallic whisper of threading steel. This was not combat as the infantry knew it. This was surgery performed on death itself, where one mistake, one stripped thread, one miscalculation of German engineering would erase the difference between hero and casualty in a fraction of a heartbeat. Fuller represented something entirely new in the machinery of modern warfare, a specialist trained not to destroy, but to unmake destruction. He was among the first generation of what the United States Army would formalize as Explosive Ordnance Disposal, men who approached the most volatile remnants of battle with nothing but knowledge, nerve, and improvised tools. They were the inheritors of a problem as old as explosives themselves, but evolved to catastrophic scale by the industrial warfare of the 20th century. By 1943, the beaches of North Africa, the rubble fields of Sicily, and soon the shattered villages of France and Germany would be littered with millions of tons of unexploded ordnance, bombs that failed to detonate, shells lodged in walls, mines hidden beneath roadways, and experimental weapons whose mechanisms even their creators barely understood. Someone had to render them safe. Someone had to walk into the shadow of delayed annihilation and disarm it before it claimed more lives. Eugene Fuller and men like him became that someone not because they were fearless, but because the alternative was unthinkable. The war had generated an unprecedented volume of explosive hazards, a byproduct of both technological ambition and industrial capacity. American, British, and German factories produced ordnance at rates that would have been inconceivable in previous conflicts. The 8th Air Force alone dropped over 700,000 tons of bombs on European targets between 1942 and 1945. A conservative estimate suggested that 10 to 15% failed to detonate on impact, not due to defects necessarily, but because of delayed fuses, impact angles, or environmental factors. That meant tens of thousands of live bombs resting in farmland, beneath collapsed buildings, in the holds of sunken ships, each one a latent catastrophe. The German Luftwaffe had left similar legacies across Britain during the Blitz, and Axis minefields stretched across North Africa like invisible graveyards. Clearing these hazards was not optional. Ports needed to function, roads needed to reopen, civilians needed to return to their homes. The war could not advance and peace could not settle until the unexploded remnants of battle were neutralized. Yet in 1942, the United States Army had no formal doctrine for this work, no dedicated units, no standardized training. Bomb disposal was an improvised art, performed by engineers, ordnance officers, and occasionally desperate volunteers who learned through trial, error, and the grim tutelage of colleagues who did not survive their mistakes. The British had been forced into developing these skills earlier, during the relentless German bombing campaigns of 1940 and 1941. Royal engineers had cataloged fuse types, documented German bomb designs, and created the first procedural manuals for rendering ordnance safe. Their knowledge was purchased with blood. Men like Lieutenant Robert Davies, who died defusing a bomb in London in 1940 when a previously unknown clockwork fuse detonated mid-disarmament. Each fatality taught a lesson. Each survival refined a technique. The Americans, entering the war later, inherited this hard-won expertise but faced their own unique challenges as they pushed into North Africa, then Italy, then the heart of occupied Europe. The men selected for bomb disposal duty did not fit a single mold. Some were engineers with a mechanical aptitude, men who understood tolerances and stress points and could visualize the internal architecture of a device they had never seen intact. Others were ordnance specialists who had worked in ammunition depots and understood propellants, fuses, and detonators. A few were simply soldiers with steady hands and a peculiar tolerance for risk, men who volunteered because someone had to, and they could not abide the thought of standing back while others walked into danger. What united them was a capacity for focused calm under existential pressure, a mental discipline that allowed them to think clearly while kneeling beside 1,000 pounds of high explosive. Training was rudimentary at first, conducted at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland and later at specialized schools in England. Students learned to identify German, Italian, and Japanese ordnance by sight. They studied fuse mechanisms, clockwork delays, barometric triggers, anti-handling devices designed to detonate if the bomb was moved. They practiced on inert replicas, then inevitably on live ordnance under controlled conditions. The curriculum was simple: understand the device, predict its behavior, intervene before it kills you. There were no second chances for those who failed the final exam. Eugene Fuller had been a mechanical engineering student at Purdue before the war, a young man who understood gears and hydraulics with the same intuitive fluency others reserved for music or language. When the Army identified his aptitude during basic training, he was pulled from the infantry pipeline and sent to Aberdeen for ordnance disposal instruction. The course lasted 6 weeks. Fuller learned that German bomb fuses came in 17 documented varieties, each with its own disarming protocol. He learned that British unexploded bombs were often more dangerous than German ones because British fuses were more complex and prone to malfunction in unpredictable ways. He learned that a bomb could sit dormant for weeks, then detonate from vibrations caused by nearby construction or even a change in atmospheric pressure. Most importantly, he learned that there was no formula for absolute safety, only calculated risk informed by experience and tempered by humility. When Fuller shipped out to North Africa in late 1942, he carried a toolkit that weighed 30 pounds. Wrenches, stethoscopes for listening to clockwork mechanisms, portable X-ray equipment for imaging internal components, and a steam injector for melting out explosive fillings. He also carried the knowledge that the average bomb disposal officer in the European theater survived approximately 18 months before death or injury removed him from duty. The work itself was intimate and isolating. A bomb disposal technician often worked alone or with a single assistant, not because of bravado but because there was no reason to risk additional lives. The procedure was methodical. First, reconnaissance, documenting the bomb's position, size, and visible features. Next, identification, matching the casing and fuse assembly to known designs. Then came the approach, clearing a safe perimeter, evacuating civilians, and preparing for the worst. The actual disarmament varied by device. Some bombs could be rendered safe by unscrewing the fuse, a delicate operation requiring the correct wrench and a steady hand. Others required more invasive techniques, drilling into the casing to drain the explosive filling, or using the steam injector to liquefy TNT or amytal so it could be pumped out. The most dangerous ordnance was fitted with anti-handling devices, secondary fuses that detonated if the bomb was tilted or moved. These required X-ray imaging to locate, then surgical precision to disarm. Every step demanded absolute concentration. A single mistake, stripping a thread, applying force at the wrong angle, failing to detect a hidden trigger, meant instantaneous death. There was no margin for error, no partial success. Either the bomb was safe or it detonated. Either the technician walked away or he vanished in a column of fire and pressure. By the time Fuller knelt beside that SC-500 in Casablanca, he had already disarmed 9 unexploded bombs across Algeria and Morocco. Each one had been different. A 250-kilogram bomb lodged in a warehouse wall, its nose fuse cracked but still armed. A British 500-pounder that had fallen into Iran harbor, requiring underwater work in near-zero visibility. A cluster of Italian anti-personnel mines scattered across a roadway, each one small enough to fit in a hand but powerful enough to sever a leg. Fuller had survived them all through a combination of knowledge, caution, and something he could not quite name, an intuitive sense for the mechanical mind of the engineers who had built these weapons. He had learned to think like them, to anticipate their logic, to understand that every bomb was a puzzle designed by another human being, and therefore solvable. But he had also attended the funerals of men who had thought the same thing and been proven fatally wrong. Lieutenant Howard Carson, killed defusing a bomb in Algiers when a previously undocumented trembler switch detonated the device as he lifted it. Sergeant Ray Mitchell, who survived 3 months of disposal work only to die when a defective fuse detonated spontaneously while he was cataloging ordnance in a storage depot. The work was unforgiving, and luck was a finite resource. The SC-500 in Casablanca harbor represented a particular challenge. German bombs of this class were often fitted with delayed-action fuses, clockwork mechanisms that could be set to detonate hours or even days after impact. The purpose was psychological as much as tactical. A bomb that might explode at any moment kept entire city blocks paralyzed, disrupted recovery efforts, and forced the enemy to divert resources to evacuation and disposal. Fuller had seen the effects firsthand. In Iran, a delayed-action bomb had detonated 36 hours after falling, collapsing a residential building and killing 11 civilians who had returned to salvage their belongings. The clockwork fuses were ingeniously cruel, small mechanical timepieces encased in brass, ticking away beneath tons of high explosive, counting down to oblivion. Disarming them required listening with a stethoscope to confirm the mechanism was still active, then carefully unscrewing the fuse assembly without jarring the clock or triggering an anti-tamper device. It was like defusing a time bomb in a film noir thriller, except the consequences were measured in hundreds of pounds of TNT and a blast radius that would vaporize everything within 50 yards. Fuller pressed the stethoscope against the bomb's casing and listened. Through the metal, faint and rhythmic, came the ticking, a mechanical heartbeat marking the seconds until detonation. The sound was almost hypnotic, a reminder that the device was alive in its own mechanical way, counting down with the indifference of clockwork. He calculated that the fuse had been set for a 72-hour delay, which meant he had perhaps 6 hours remaining before the mechanism completed its cycle. 6 hours was a comfortable margin by bomb disposal standards, but Fuller knew that clockwork fuses were prone to acceleration if damaged on impact. The bomb had punched through wooden decking, which meant the mechanism had absorbed shock. It might run fast, it might run slow. There was no way to know without disarming it, which required accepting that the next turn of his wrench might be the last action he ever performed. He selected the appropriate diffuser wrench from his toolkit, a custom tool designed to fit the specific threading of German fuse assemblies, and positioned it over the locking ring. The first turn was always the most dangerous. If the bomb was fitted with an anti-handling device, this was when it would detonate. Fuller applied pressure slowly, feeling for resistance for any indication that the threads were binding or that a secondary mechanism was engaging. The wrench turned. Nothing exploded. He exhaled, then took another quarter turn, then another. The fuse assembly began to loosen, unscrewing incrementally from the bomb's casing. Through the stethoscope, he could still hear the ticking, unchanged, indifferent. 5 more turns. 10. The fuse assembly came free, the clockwork mechanism still intact, still ticking in his hand like a malevolent watch. Fuller set it gently on the sand, then turned his attention to the main explosive charge. With the fuse removed, the bomb was inert, merely a steel cylinder filled with TNT. He marked it for demolition teams to destroy in a controlled detonation later. The crisis was over. The harbor could reopen. Cargo ships could resume unloading supplies for the Allied advance into Tunisia. One more bomb rendered safe, one more catastrophe averted. But Fuller understood, as all bomb disposal technicians understood, that success was temporary. Somewhere ahead in Sicily or Italy or France, another unexploded bomb was waiting. Another fuse was ticking. Another man would kneel in the dirt with a wrench and a prayer, betting his life that he understood the mind of the engineer who had built the device. The work was Sisyphean, a battle against the accumulated ordnance of industrial warfare, a battle that could be won one bomb at a time but never finished, because the war produced explosives faster than any team of specialists could clear them. By 1943, the U.S. Army had begun formalizing bomb disposal into a dedicated branch. The 414th Ordnance Company became one of the first specialized EOD units, trained specifically for the European theater. Similar units deployed to the Pacific, where they faced Japanese ordnance that was often more primitive but no less deadly, bombs filled with picric acid that could detonate from corrosion, mines constructed from recycled materials, and kamikaze explosives designed to kill the diffuser. The men of these units developed a grim camaraderie, bound by shared understanding that their survival was always provisional, always dependent on knowledge and luck in equal measure. What these men expected when they volunteered for bomb disposal training was often romantic, a vision of themselves as heroes, solving mechanical puzzles, saving lives through courage and intellect. What they experienced was far more brutal and prosaic. They learned that heroism was not a moment of glory but a repetition of small, terrifying decisions made in isolation. They learned that most bombs did not detonate dramatically when disturbed, they simply erased the technician and everything within the blast radius before anyone could process what had happened. They learned to compartmentalize fear, to function while knowing that each job might be their last, to sleep at night despite recurring dreams of fuses and clockwork and sudden obliteration. They learned to trust their training and their tools, but also to accept that training had limits, that tools could fail, and that some bombs were simply too degraded or too cunningly designed to be disarmed safely. In those cases, the only option was controlled detonation, destroying the bomb in place, accepting collateral damage to buildings or terrain as the lesser evil compared to the risk of a technician's death. The psychological toll was immense. Men who survived months of bomb disposal often exhibited symptoms that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance, intrusive memories, and inability to relax even in rear areas. Some developed obsessive habits, checking and rechecking equipment, rehearsing procedures endlessly, as if perfect preparation could eliminate the element of chance. Others became fatalistic, convinced that their death was inevitable and choosing to face it with dark humor and reckless bravery. A few simply broke, their nerves shattered after one too many close calls and were quietly reassigned to other duties. The Army made little effort to address these psychological casualties. Mental health support was rudimentary, and there was an unspoken expectation that soldiers would simply endure. Bomb disposal technicians endured more than most, carrying burdens that were invisible but no less crippling than physical wounds. Yet they continued. Through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and into Germany itself, bomb disposal units advanced alongside the infantry, clearing paths through minefields, defusing ordnance in captured cities, rendering safe the explosive detritus of retreating German forces. The scope of the work expanded exponentially after D-Day. Normandy's hedgerows concealed thousands of mines. French villages were riddled with unexploded shells from preliminary bombardments. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, they encountered stockpiles of experimental weapons, bombs fitted with exotic fuses, chemical ordnance and prototypes designed by engineers who had run out of conventional materials and improvised with whatever they could find. Some of these devices were so novel that no manual existed. Technicians had to deduce their function through observation and educated guesswork, a process that sometimes succeeded and sometimes resulted in catastrophic failure. The symbolic weight of this work was profound, though rarely articulated at the time. Bomb disposal technicians were literally dismantling the machinery of destruction, taking apart the tools of annihilation piece by piece. In doing so, they represented a particular kind of American optimism, the belief that knowledge and skill could overcome chaos, that even the most deadly creations of human ingenuity could be understood and neutralized. This was not the brute force of the infantry or the overwhelming firepower of the artillery. This was precision, patience, and intellect applied to the problem of death itself. It was a kind of faith that the universe operated according to rules, that those rules could be learned, and that understanding them conferred a measure of control even in the most desperate circumstances. The tools of bomb disposal became symbols in their own right. The diffuser wrench, custom machined to fit specific fuse types, represented the marriage of craftsmanship and desperation, a tool that existed only because men needed to unscrew death. The stethoscope, borrowed from medicine and repurposed to listen to the mechanical heartbeat of bombs, embodied the diagnostic mindset, the belief that even a ticking fuse could be understood if one listened carefully enough. The portable X-ray machine, cumbersome and unreliable, offered a glimpse inside the sealed mystery of a bomb casing, a way to see the invisible and make informed decisions rather than blind guesses. These tools were humble, often inadequate, sometimes improvised in the field from scavenged materials, but they were all that stood between a bomb disposal technician and oblivion. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, bomb disposal units had rendered safe an estimated 45,000 unexploded bombs, cleared thousands of miles of roads through minefields, and neutralized countless smaller ordnance items. The cost was measured in lives. The U.S. Army did not compile comprehensive casualty statistics for bomb disposal specialists, but British records, which were more meticulous, documented that approximately 1 in 10 bomb disposal officers was killed in the line of duty, with many more injured. The American toll was likely comparable. These men died in explosions that rarely left identifiable remains, their deaths often unwitnessed, their final moments reducible to a flash and a crater. They were buried with honors when bodies could be recovered, and mourned as abstractions when they could not. Their names were recorded in unit histories and casualty reports, but the nature of their work meant that individual acts of heroism often went undocumented. There were no dramatic charges, no visible enemy to defeat, no moments that translated easily into the language of valor and sacrifice. Just men, alone or nearly so, making choices that required a particular kind of courage. The courage to confront annihilation methodically, to trust in knowledge and procedure, to believe that expertise mattered even when death was one mistake away. The war in the Pacific presented different challenges. Japanese ordnance was often less sophisticated than German designs, but no less deadly. American bomb disposal technicians island-hopping across the Pacific encountered Type 98 bombs filled with picric acid, a powerful but corrosive explosive that became more sensitive over time. These bombs, when damaged or aged, could detonate from vibrations or even changes in temperature. Technicians learned to approach them with extreme caution, often choosing to detonate them in place rather than risk disarmament. Japanese mines, too, were treacherous, simple in design but often constructed with improvised components that behaved unpredictably. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, disposal teams cleared beaches and airstrips under fire, working with the knowledge that enemy snipers might target them while they knelt beside live ordnance. The Pacific Theater also introduced the grim task of clearing ordnance from caves and tunnels where Japanese forces had made their final stands. These spaces, cramped and dark, filled with the stench of death and explosives, became some of the most dangerous work environments of the war. Technicians entered with flashlights and tools, never knowing if the next step would trigger a booby trap or collapse a tunnel rigged with demolition charges. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 marked a chilling evolution in the scale of explosive ordnance, though the immediate bomb disposal implications were limited. What the atomic bomb represented, however, was the logical endpoint of the trajectory that had made bomb disposal necessary in the first place: the industrialization of destruction, the creation of weapons so powerful that their use fundamentally altered the calculus of warfare. The men who had spent years defusing conventional bombs understood this better than most. They had seen what explosives could do to human bodies, to cities, to landscapes. They had intimate knowledge of the mechanics of annihilation. The idea of a single bomb erasing an entire city was both unimaginable and grimly predictable, the ultimate expression of the explosive power they had spent the war trying to contain. After the war, many bomb disposal specialists returned home, carrying skills that had limited peacetime application and memories that rarely translated into civilian conversation. Some stayed in the military, helping to establish the formal Explosive Ordnance Disposal program that would become a permanent fixture of the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force. Others found work in related fields: demolition, mining, construction, places where their expertise with explosives could be applied without the existential stakes. A few wrote memoirs or gave interviews, preserving fragments of their experiences for historians and future generations. But many simply tried to forget, to reintegrate into a world where bombs did not tick beneath buildings and death did not wait coiled in steel and TNT. They were haunted not by what they had done, but by what they had survived, by the knowledge that their continued existence was the product of skill and chance in measures they could never quite disentangle. The legacy of these pioneers extended far beyond their individual service. The techniques and doctrines they developed, often through trial and tragedy, became the foundation for modern explosive ordnance disposal. The training programs, the tool designs, the procedural manuals, all were refined and expanded, but the core principles remained the same. Understand the device, predict its behavior, intervene with precision and caution. Accept that risk cannot be eliminated, only managed. These principles guided EOD technicians in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, where the nature of ordnance evolved but the fundamental challenge remained: how to approach death deliberately and unmake it before it claimed more lives. The improvised explosive devices of modern asymmetric warfare, though different in construction and employment, required the same mental discipline, the same tolerance for existential risk, the same faith in knowledge and procedure that Eugene Fuller demonstrated in Casablanca in 1943. The unexploded ordnance of World War II, meanwhile, continued to kill long after the war ended. In Europe, farmers still unearthed bombs and shells decades later, their casings corroded, their fuses degraded into unpredictability. Every year, people die when construction equipment strikes a forgotten bomb, or a fisherman's net drags up a naval mine, or a curious child finds a rusted shell in the woods. The war's explosive legacy persists, a reminder that destruction once created is difficult to fully erase. The men who spent the war trying to erase it one bomb at a time were engaged in a struggle that transcended their individual survival. They were attempting to restore order to a world torn by violence, to make safe the spaces where people lived and worked and raised children. It was Sisyphean work, but it was also essential, a quiet, unglamorous form of heroism that saved countless lives and received little recognition. In the silence after the diffuser wrench made its final turn, in the moment when a fuse came free and a bomb became inert, there was a kind of victory. It was not the victory of battle, not the triumph of overwhelming force. It was subtler, more personal, the victory of understanding over chaos, of skill over chance, of life over death. Eugene Fuller felt that victory kneeling in the sand beside Casablanca harbor, the diffused clockwork mechanism in his hand, the Atlantic wind carrying away the smell of cordite. He felt it again in Sicily, in Italy, in France, each time he walked away from a bomb that would never detonate. It was a victory that had to be won again and again, that offered no permanent resolution, that demanded everything and promised nothing. But it was real. It mattered. It made the difference between a harbor that could reopen and one that remained paralyzed. Between a village where families could return and one that remained a death trap. Between a road that armies could advance along and one that remained impassable. The bomb disposal specialists of World War II were not motivated by ideology or grand strategy. They did not speak in the language of democracy versus fascism, though that struggle framed their work. They were motivated by something more immediate and more human: the desire to prevent suffering, to protect the soldiers and civilians around them, to impose order on the chaos that war had created. They approached their work with the pragmatism of engineers and the humility of men who understood that they were fallible, that their knowledge was incomplete, that every job carried the risk of failure. This humility was not weakness. It was wisdom, earned through experience and the memory of colleagues who had not been humble enough or careful enough or lucky enough. As the war receded into history, the image of the bomb disposal technician became iconic in a quiet way. The lone figure kneeling beside a bomb, tools in hand, calm in the face of annihilation. It was an image that captured something essential about a particular kind of courage, a courage that was not about aggression or dominance but about facing fear methodically, about trusting in expertise and procedure when instincts screamed to run. It was the courage of the surgeon, of the test pilot, of anyone who must perform with precision when the cost of error is absolute. It was, in its way, a very American form of heroism, practical, innovative, optimistic in its faith that problems could be solved, that knowledge mattered, that individual skill and determination could overcome even the most deadly legacies of industrial warfare. The ticking of the clockwork fuse, that mechanical heartbeat counting down to oblivion, became a symbol of the existential threat that these men confronted. It was the sound of mortality made audible, the reminder that time was finite and that every second mattered. But it was also paradoxically a source of information, a diagnostic tool that told the technician the mechanism was functioning, that the bomb could still be disarmed, that there was time to act. The ticking was both threat and opportunity, death and knowledge intertwined. Learning to listen to that ticking, to interpret its rhythm, to understand what it revealed about the bomb's internal state, that was the essence of the bomb disposal technician's craft. In the decades after the war, as the urgency faded and the memory of those terrifying years began to blur, the contributions of bomb disposal specialists were often overlooked in favor of more dramatic narratives: the infantry assaults, the armored advances, the strategic bombing campaigns. This was perhaps inevitable. Their work was solitary, technical, difficult to narrate in the language of heroism and sacrifice that the public understood. But the oversight was also a loss, because the story of bomb disposal contained essential truths about the nature of modern warfare and the human response to its horrors. It was a story about the limits of violence, about the necessity of dismantling destruction before rebuilding could begin. It was a story about the men who volunteered to do that work, who walked toward danger while others walked away, who accepted the burden of rendering safe the explosive remnants of a conflict that had consumed the world. Eugene Fuller survived the war. He returned to Indiana in 1946, completed his engineering degree, and worked for 30 years designing hydraulic systems for heavy machinery. He rarely spoke about his time in bomb disposal, and when he did, it was with a matter-of-fact brevity that suggested the memories were too heavy for casual conversation. He attended reunions of the 414th Ordnance Company when he could, gatherings of men who shared a bond forged in isolation and danger, who understood without speaking what it meant to kneel beside a ticking bomb and bet your life on your training. Fuller died in 1989, his obituary noting his wartime service in a single sentence: "The bombs he defused, the lives he saved, the quiet victories he achieved, these were not recorded in any detail, lost to the inevitable forgetting that follows even the most significant events." But the work endures. Every time a construction crew in France or Germany unearths a corroded bomb and calls the authorities, bomb disposal technicians respond, carrying forward the legacy of Fuller and his contemporaries. The tools have improved, the training is more comprehensive, the understanding of ordnance is deeper. But the fundamental challenge remains: approaching death deliberately, understanding its mechanisms, disarming it before it claims more victims. It is work that requires a peculiar alchemy of knowledge, nerve, and humility. It is work that saves lives in quiet ways without headlines or fanfare. It is work that testifies to a particular human capacity, the capacity to confront the most deadly creations of human ingenuity and unmake them, piece by piece, bomb by bomb, one diffused fuse at a time. In the end, the story of the bomb disposal pioneers is not about heroism in the conventional sense. It is about persistence in the face of impossible odds, about the grinding, unglamorous work of making the world safe again after violence has shattered it. It is about men who understood that survival was never guaranteed, that every job carried the risk of sudden death, and who chose to do the work anyway because it was necessary, because someone had to, because they could not walk away from the ticking. It is a story that speaks to the deeper currents of the American experience: the belief in practical problem-solving, the faith in expertise and innovation, the willingness to confront danger when the stakes demand it. These men did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as technicians doing a job, solving a problem, applying their skills to a desperate need. That modesty, that focus on the work rather than the glory, is perhaps the most enduring lesson of their service. The wrench turned, the fuse unscrewed, the ticking stopped, and the world for one more moment was a little less dangerous, a little more survivable. That was the victory, that was the legacy. That was what the bomb disposal pioneers of World War II achieved, one diffused bomb at a time, in harbors and villages and battlefields across the burning world. They walked toward the ticking when others could not, and in doing so they earned a place in history that is too often forgotten but too important to ignore. They were the ones who dismantled death, who made peace possible by rendering war's remnants safe. They were the Explosive Ordnance Disposal pioneers, and their courage, quiet and methodical and absolute, deserves to be remembered.